Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian.
And I'm Kat Spada, and this season, our feminist media criticism has come to us through the implanted memories of our adventures on Mars. This is the season of Cyberpunk.
Mr. Deckard, Dr. Eldon Terrell.
The new millennium, this is amazing, will bring a new experience.
How do you fit all that in your head anyway?
I had to dump a chunk of long-term memory.
This is gonna be fun, Terry.
Who is this?
Take this thing out of the case and stick it up your nose.
Mozart's Ghost, the hottest band on the internet.
This week we are discussing the 1990 sci-fi action film Total Recall from director Paul Verhoeven, based on Philip K. Dick's 1966 short story, We Can Remember It for You Wholesale. I added the commas on my own. The movie stars Arnold Schwarzenegger as a construction worker who receives implanted memories of his time working as a spy on Mars, or is he a Martian spy whose memories of life as a construction worker were implanted? Nobody knows.
This movie co-stars Rachel Ticotin, Sharon Stone, and Michael Ironside. And Total Recall was a box office success despite a fraught production. It struggled through development and pre-production since the producer acquired the rights to the original story all the way back in 1974. Shot largely in sequence on sound stages in Mexico, with Nevada's Valley of Fire State Park standing in for Martian exteriors. Illnesses and injuries plagued the cast and crew throughout filming.
Your mind, it is the center of your life. It is everything you hear, everything you see, everything you feel. It is everything you are. How would you know if someone stole your mind?
Some of the movie's gory violence was trimmed to bring the rating from an X to an R, but it remains well remembered for its largely practical special effects using prosthetics, animatronics, and miniatures. Total Recall was the winner of the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, and it was the only nominee in that year's category.
That was really weird to me, unless Wikipedia had it wrong. But joining us to talk about this filme is a professor, a podcaster, and prolific author. At USC, she teaches English, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and American Studies and Ethnicity, and she chairs the Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. Her podcasts include the Gen X pop culture show Waiting to Exhale, and she is the author of Relocations, Queer Suburban Imaginaries, and Why Karen Carpenter Matters. Welcome to the show, Karen Tongson.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. We have been having a really fun and weird time looking at the late 80s and the 90s and up to about 2000, 2001, how Hollywood is talking about the net and sci-fi and like what life is when we have a little bit of virtual reality in our real world. But would you tell us a little bit about yourself and pop culture being like a big part of your academic and personal interests? Like, how did that get started?
I don't know how to frame that. I mean, it's because, I think that the historical answer is that I was born and partially raised in the Philippines, which is, as the author Jessica Hagedorn said, spent 400 years in a convent and 50 years, now closer to 100, in Hollywood. So pop culture, US pop culture in particular, is, constitutive of this colonial legacy that I'm a part of, that I grew up with, that, so much of talk about not knowing what are real memories or implanted ones, the difference between the things that we, remember and know from growing up there versus like all of these, pop cultural memories and things that we admired on TV or in the movies forming and shaping so many of our memories. Mm-hmm. Or the music. That's the Karen Carpenter book kind of goes into that. So I think part of what I've been doing throughout my entire academic career and other sort of side hustles or whatever you want to call them is thinking about how pop culture, how we can continue to take pleasure in the pop culture that's so important to us, while also understanding some of the reasons that we've been implanted, again, to kind of stick with the Total Recall theme, with some of these memories in nefarious ways.
Yeah, I think there's something, I mean, I remember in some of my first like film classes in college and reading about the hyperreal and how what's remembered is maybe more important or more real than what actually happened. And I think that that's something we've been grappling a little bit with this season. And even in last season, when we looked at Hollywood throughout the decades of the 20th century, like, oh, was culture actually like this, or did it become like this because it's how it was represented? And I think that's where, like, one of my notes in this movie, there's like a red pill moment. And I was like, wait, what does red pilling mean in the Matrix? And what does red pilling mean on the internet for like men's rights activists? Like trying to kind of follow the journey of like, what is this even? Where did this start? And what does it mean now? And I have no recollection. Like the actual, like, was the internet like this in not this isn't a movie necessarily about the internet, but like, where were we in 1966 by way of 1990, looking back at it in 2022? It's a trip, man.
Well, the one constant is that we've been having this kind of debate about reality, what is virtual, what are merely shadows on the wall since Plato's The Cave, right? And the allegories of the cave, and just the idea of, you know, how much of our experience of life is in some way mediated, hence the word media, right? And so literature, so 1966, even with just radio, television as a new thing, cinema coming into its own, Philip K. Dick would have plenty to work with around thinking about mediation and about what's real and what's not. And so, you know, I think that that's the idea that somehow you can reach some truth that is not that shadow on the cave is the thing that entices people to that red pill.
Yeah, I'm having so much college flashback just in this tiny little intro of all of this. I'm really curious as we start this conversation, what y'all's relationship with Paul Verhoeven's films are. They're so specific and unique and their own flavor. And I'm curious, like, when you enter into this space of watching Total Recall for the first or 500th time, like what's your relationship with his whole canon?
Well, I don't know. There's something about his canon that's super like fashy, i.e. fascist kind of, or like has certain, it grapples with these kind of fascist aesthetics. And especially as, you know, the 80s was rolling on and technology was getting folded into that idea. RoboCop, for example, right? Like these machines that, or Starship Troopers, which is very much a kind of like at once a real fascinated look at, you know, a militarized force, right? In some way, like there's something that's like super like macho, very into like violence and guns and buff dudes. I mean, look, fascism also has its fair share of homoeroticism with its eroticism of the male body and muscles, Casper Van Dien and that whole thing. So, you know, if you look at Paul Verhoeven's oeuvre, like, and when he was born in 1938, you know, in the Netherlands, there's a lot there that's still grappling with the legacies of fascism, World War II, Nazis, etc. And this, like, he, I think, is working through that in a lot of sci-fi that was probably also like sourced from like Total Recall authors like Philip K. Dick, who were working with some of those themes and ideas themselves.
But has anybody investigated that theme in Showgirls?
I mean, I'm pretty sure there's some media scholar out there who has, but you know, but yeah.
And I do think about that because like Starship Troopers, Total Recall, and RoboCop are so similar in aesthetic, theme, texture. And then you move forward and like, you know, last year you get Benedetta and you're like, how is this the same director? Like you can kind of see the threads, but like, I feel like when we think of Verhoeven, we definitely think of this sort of trifecta of these movies, even though he's clearly done a lot more outside of it. But there's just this sweet spot in these three, the aesthetic of these three. So I had never seen Total Recall before. I watched it for this podcast. Have you both seen it before?
I saw it back in the day. I was like a senior in high school when it came out. I'm much older than I appear, I think. But I saw it, you know, it was like one of those movies I watched with my friends in high school. And the one thing that struck me about rewatching it, it's been a while, but I rewatched it for this pod, is how kinky it is. And there's like kink, and like I've been listening to Karina Longworth's latest season of You Must Remember This, erotic 80s, right? Mm-hmm. So I was thinking a little bit about how this is a kind of switch point from the erotic 80s in many respects, but just like from the jump, the way Sharon Stone kisses Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's like excessive and demonstrative tongue.
Yeah.
I started watching this movie and I'm like, holy shit, she's really hot. And I was just like in this way that I was like, it wasn't just like, oh, pretty hot people. Like I kept being drawn into being like uncomfortably beautiful. And I was like, and she looks kind of familiar. And I was like, no, she's just whatever. And then I was like, no, she looks really familiar, right? And it took me like 20 minutes of this back and forth for me to just Google it and be like, oh my God, it's Sharon Stone. like I felt like such an idiot after that. But there's something about the way she looks in this that is just like on another level.
So I have spoken a lot on podcasts about like growing up in the 90s and having these sorts of movies being really kind of formative for me. So like, this is a movie where I'm like, I'm sure I watched this when I was little, like when it was on HBO or something, and was like confusingly horny because of it, you know, like when I was too young to really understand. But also I've always really loved a macho movie. I've always really been drawn to like these kinds of cartoonishly violent movies, and I think a lot of that is because I'm like a fairly like meek and anxious person in terms of conflict. So I like to see this on screen. I want to watch everything from, I won't spoil Anita's Freq Out, but I'm really excited for us to talk about it more, or like Ong Bak or Shoot 'Em Up, which came out, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. But then I worked for the film studios when they did the remake of this and RoboCop, and they were just so dark and like kind of dreary. And I thought, this isn't what this wasn't the like fun Arnold Schwarzenegger type of movie that I loved as a little kid and sort of can look back on. So I was watching this a little bit with fresh eyes. Like I didn't quite remember what the progression of the story was going to be, but every set piece I felt like was, again, like, do I remember watching it, or do I think I remember watching it because I've seen it memed so many times? Like that's kind of the question of Arnold's exploding face, or the iconically triple-breasted woman who, I mean, I can't be the only person who had like an early sexual awakening to that. So.
It's way broader and campier than I remembered. Mm-hmm. There was some part of me, I think, so used to the tones of contemporary like sci-fi and fantasy and things like that, you know, where you know, kind of there's a seriousness to the look, there's a seriousness to the acting, and kind of, you know, like even the sequel to Blade Runner, right? Like the drama of that, like that tonality, right?
Yeah.
But you know, this is almost cartoonish, like in part because of those visual effects that Anita was referring to, right, earlier, but also because of Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Schwarzenegger of it all is just that the guy really doesn't act as much as he flexes. And I think that that's what we're supposed to, you know, get into. And I think that all of these different prostheses, I think that's what the kind of dichotomy between the blonde wife, who turns out to be, spoiler alert, sinister and evil, and the kind of demure yet, as they say, also slightly slutty. I can't remember what the word was that they used. Was it sleazy?
It was sleazy and demure.
Yeah, the sleazy and demure brunette, right? The kind of ideal archetype.
Best
and just,
of both worlds.
Exactly. And just seeing, Schwarzenegger kind of work through all of those conflicting desires, right? It's just, I don't know. I just feel like that's one thing that struck me about it, just tonally. It's so broad. And, and I think about when I have memories of myself watching it, I think about it being a much deeper experience than it turned out to be rewatching it.
Yeah. And I think that that's like a time thing, right? Like time, age, maturity, and also the access to material, like the way that stories are told today. Like I think that thematicness we have in more, I don't know, and not to be demeaning, but like in more mature ways or more thoughtful ways or more academic ways, right? And yeah, I feel like it's the Schwarzenegger of it all. It's also the Verhoeven of it all, like it's so over the top in what it's trying to do and what it's trying to say. And that's part of the charm of it to me. I really liked this movie. Like I enjoyed watching it, although I was babysitting some really raucous dogs. And so the last half of it is a little blurry to me because I was dealing with that madness. But what struck me and where I was instantly like immersed in this world is I think that the production design and the props were so brilliant. Like I actually wrote a list of all of the like technology, like the futuristic stuff, because I think in a lot of sci-fi today, like, I don't know, that maybe I'm going to regret saying it that way, but like there's something about this movie where the technology and the believability of what's happening in this future time is so baked into every aspect of the film. Like, it's not like there's just some weird like wall TV in the background. It's like, no, they're using the wall TV. They're using the video chat. They're using all of these like very specific types of futuristic technology that's a part of the story. It's a part of the character development and it's a part of the world in a way that I'm like, yes, show me this, right? It's not just texture kind of hanging out. It's like really thought through, and that immediately pulls me in, right? Like the Johnny cab with the mannequin driver, right? That's just like really also aesthetically is really weird even for the world. Like little things like that I really appreciate.
Can we talk about just the Arnold of it all? Like we're talking about Arnold in 1990, and he's endlessly fascinating to me as a human being, but as a Hollywood star, like the way that I feel like every effort is made in this like 30 years worth of Arnold's films to just make him seem as American as possible, or sort of like blandly everyman, when he's Mr. Olympus and he has this, early in his career, thick Austrian accent. And like, it can be really funny to me, like in your comedy Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, when there's just like the moment where they're like, guess he does push-ups every morning, and that explains that. Like, and there's sort of no like kind of reference. I was like, okay, so he's a construction worker, which he's not, but whatever. But the way that he's supposed to just be like this shell of a person, and then I think that kind of lends to like he's not acting, he's just kind of being this presence. And it's so weird to me because I feel like no one could identify with this man. He's so unusual. He's such a physical specimen. He's just strange. All his like screams and vocalizations that he does are so strange. But at the same time, it's just like we all buy it. We're all like, yeah, that's our hero. That's the guy. He's just married to whoever he's married to. Like, this is my way into this movie. And we're here in 1990, in between Twins and Kindergarten Cop, but before Terminator 2. Like, this is just the ultimate movie star of the moment. Like, how I just think there's something so strange about that, and how like ultimately, we don't need to get into it, but then eventually that he would become a politician and like become this sort of like the Schwarzenegger of Schwarzeneggers. Like there's just like something about him.
Well, the US had a certain fascination with oafish masculinity, or like a kind of massive masculinity. When you think about the Rambo films in the early 80s, and think about, or the Rocky films, think about Stallone as someone who's, not say an eloquent Shakespearean actor, but one who uses his physicality in his roles and also charms people with his humor because he's big and he sounds different, and he's still an everyday guy. I think Schwarzenegger kind of established his career in an arc, his star text, in a way that's not too different from Stallone's, insofar as he is also that kind of block of dude who, it doesn't really matter what he says except for a couple of catchphrases, and it's all about what he does or what we can project onto him, and most importantly, the kind of masculinity that we can admire him modeling for us.
Yeah, and like you're saying, in the 80s, there's just this huge surge of like very, very hyper masculine representation that's very aesthetic, right? Which isn't that different than the marvelization of men's bodies and expectations around that. And I think the piece that's really interesting here is the acting expectation, right? Like we didn't really expect Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone and I can picture
Dolph
him.
Lundgren.
Yeah, I'm just like picturing all these dudes, right? We don't really expect them to act as much as be, right? Like be macho. But now I think we have higher expectations for actors. So you so much so that like, I think the first time many of us saw Chris Hemsworth like could be funny and like is a good comedic actor, we're sort of surprised. And I wonder if that has something to do with our expectations of what it means to be big and macho and like butch in the non-dykey sense, right? Like in the like masculine buff sense. So yeah, like does our expectations of representations of masculinity have they actually changed very much? And like not really, right?
Yeah, I think about The Rock today as like a similarly sort of, and I think it's changing, but like for a long time in his career, a little bit of an amorphous character. And the Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood podcast, they've sometimes talked about like when The Rock is perceived as a Black man in movies versus when he's not. And a lot of times I think that dividing line is like what background of woman he's paired up with, and like what an audience will react to or not react to. And like there's just something about the fill in the blank of like this particular type of macho person. And then now I think we do expect a little bit more, and we want to know a little bit more about this person, if they're going to really have a indelible legacy and like the type of person that we want to see on screen. I mean, I guess we'll see how that continues to go on if he follows the Arnold trajectory.
And I feel like The Rock is a really good example here because like him, and I've never thought of this before this moment, so who knows what's going to come out of my mouth, but I feel like him and Arnold are very similar in that like they both play the same fucking character over and over again. There's not a high expectation around like depth and nuance in their acting, and they do like kids movies or like, kind of goofy whatever movies and these big serious blockbusters, and they're just meant to be these big dudes. And like, granted, there are obviously differences. People are going to point them out. It's fine. But I feel like there's a similar expectation and they fulfill similar roles in our pop culture.
I do think that kind of big dude is an exception more than the rule, because I think that there is, of course, the marvelization thing that you're talking about where, we're seeing, people like Kumail, like pump himself up and things like that, and people reacting to it really terribly. Right. And in some ways, it's okay for some dudes to be buff and other dudes can't be or shouldn't be, or that's gross or weird or what have you. Right. It's kind of a fascinating thing to see that often around kind of specific kinds of men of color. Right. and the certain expectations we have and the different ways that we project masculinity onto different ways that men are racialized. But the other thing is that in the kind of Apatow, post Apatow world also, where you have guys like Jason Segel, and why am I forgetting his name now? What's his name? The dude in Long Shot, Seth Rogen. Okay. In the kind of where we have people in the post Apatow world like Jason Segel or Seth Rogen, or folks, or even somebody like James Franco from that crowd. You have these different supposedly evolved iterations of masculinity or other kinds of masculinity that are supposed to be admired and thought of as in some ways heroic and lovable because of their everydayness, because of their lack of buffness in some way. So I don't know. I do think that there's a way that we keep those buff guys as exceptions, and then that there's something else going on with how socially we're trying to kind of create
I think that's
range of those things.
True. But I also just want to add that like we've always allowed different kinds of men, especially white men, to be represented. And we have not allowed different types of women to be represented. And I think that what might be different now is a very limited growing space for men of color to be a part of the range and variety. Right. And huge caveats, very limited. But in yeah, I agree that big buffness is the exception, and it is almost comical, right? But that's the thing, is we always got the dopey husband, and we always got the movie star good looks, and we always got the trickster, right? And then we had one body type of a woman.
Well,
and she could be blonde or brunette, and that's it,
Well, look at this movie, right? So this is Sharon Stone. She's been in a few things. And then after this, Verhoeven puts her in Basic Instinct, and she has this big career. What happens to Rachel Ticotin? She's, as far as I know, hardly ever heard from again. And she's the heroine of this movie, as far as we know. I mean, I guess we don't see her until later on in the film, but Verhoeven doesn't decide to put her in Basic Instinct. He goes with the person who's going to be this Hollywood bombshell. And that's just kind of the story of so many actresses. And
that is this is not a film that has great representations of women. It's very, Laurie, Sharon Stone's character, is quote unquote crazy because she's mad about a dream he had, right? Just very stereotypical, jealous, wife, girlfriend. The way that they talk about women in this, of meet a beautiful exotic woman and build your perfect woman, and the binary set of choices of he chooses sleazy and demure and body type and hair color. And yes, in terms of a storytelling component, it's interesting because he's literally describing someone he knows, which is also disturbing. That's how he would describe her. But that you can just do that, right? And maybe theoretically in this world, you can do that with people of all genders, and all genders get in on this, creating their fantasy, which I also think is a problem. But then you get into the brothel, and that's or the sex club, i.e. the kink club. I don't know what the space is. And that's where you get it could be interesting, except they're this chick has 3 boobs. She's got 3 boobs. Did you know she's got 3 boobs? Just over and over and over again. This was in the hands of a director who is not thinking about gender equity in the way that this movie is being presented. So it worries me when, he gets the flyer with the strip club on it, and that's his point. And then they're going to the seedy, lower class environment. And yes, it's kind of a commentary on the world, but not, I don't know, it just felt like it fed into certain stereotypes that I found a little frustrating, even though I feel like it could have been done in a way where you're more supportive, or it's less gazy, you know?
Even with the taxi driver on Mars, you know, who's a blend of stereotypes, like pick one per scene. But yeah.
Yeah. And like you have this sort of black sidekick, which like, holy stereotypes, man. And then turns out to be a villain. So that's cool. And you're just like, cool. You made it worse. That's awesome.
Yeah. I think that it's what the world that Total Recall leaves us with is one that establishes a core couple, the reclamation of their relationship from something that was built around deceit into something that is, I guess, more honest now, insofar as, you know, Quaid, when he was, I can't even remember the name of his original like evil conspiratorial self when he was working with the bad guy on Mars. But Hauser, yeah, exactly. The more Germanic name.
Yeah.
So Hauser was, you know, deceived, had ended up deceiving Rachel Zakotan's character into thinking that he was a revolutionary, but he actually wasn't, right? So in the end, that web of lies has been resolved, and purportedly they can live together now in freedom with a beautiful new atmosphere that they released into the world that liberates the greatest number of people on the planet.
Can we talk about those effects for a second?
Which so, like, starts the movie starts there, by the way. So if you go into the movie theater and you're like, this isn't for me, you can get out right away.
The bug eye, like there. So you know what's like at this point, it's the end of the movie. You know what's happening. They go out into the atmosphere. The one guy's face fucking melts off and his eyes bug out of his head. And then they go out into the atmosphere and their eyes are starting to bug out. And you're like, does that just go back in? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I was just like, yeah, I mean, how do they just like return to looking hot? You know what I mean? It's like, it's just like after that also, especially because we are introduced to people who in the kind of red light district who supposedly suffered oxygen deprivation in the past, and their bodies and faces remain scarred and altered by it, you know? And but of course we get to leave our protagonists with, you know, everything intact, and in fact a better world intact for them, as opposed to, you know, the kind of, I guess, instrumentalized relationship between Laurie, the Sharon Stone character, and Quaid, and of course her true lover, the really bad guy, the henchman, who has like some jealousy about her role.
Which I think listening to you talk kind of got me more closer to the point of like, you know, the red light district, you have people who have physical disabilities, or more like a little bit disfigured, I guess, non-traditional appearances. And there's a sense that like this guy's fighting for them and gonna like liberate them. And then you have the flip, right? Where it's like, nope, it was all just a trick. So he gets free and now he's like one of them. Like, you know, like what? Like, what is the point that you're making about class here, right? Because the movie starts very deeply entrenched in class.
Yeah.
Because, you know, he's too poor to travel. He does manual labor. He, you know, there's this whole thing about buying a memory. So you think you went on a trip, but didn't. So like class is clearly a component throughout this whole film.
Although he does live in a pretty nice apartment.
Yes. Yeah. Which I would just like to say, one of the pieces of technology in this movie that I would like is the TV wall, where you have panels and then you can like close them with art or whatever, or wallpaper, and then you can open them again and you can watch things on like 1 or 3. Like that's my dream, is just have like wall screens.
I will vote for I like a manicure. So I liked the
the
lady at the recall office who could just like change her nails. But Karen,
one of the things, I guess I just wanted to say, like, since we're on technology, one of the things that struck me is how little we understood how easy it would be to be tracked or surveyed in the future, because the tracking of it, you know, it would be a much more difficult thing to get rid of whatever tracking device now, and you know, the kind of the bulkiness of the tracking and how dramatic it is having to be wrenched from his brain, right? When honestly, just like any device now will track you.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like it felt very innocent to see a world of surveillance that wasn't even as bad as the one we live in now.
Yeah, right. Like I love that he's got a bug in his brain, so he wraps a wet towel around his head, and that's gonna stop it from transmitting. And I'm just like, to your point, Karen, like, is that what they thought? Like, or was that a plausible? Because today, you know, like it's hilarious for us to laugh about that now, but like, was that also funny back then? Also, the shoving the thing up your nose and pulling the bug out, like that was wonderful and terrible all at the same time.
Now, I don't want to get away from, we were talking about the ending and like, would you go back to being hot after your tongue had like exploded? And I do think that that is like perhaps our proof that the ending is not real. Like that's maybe the question we're supposed to leave on is like, did they die there? Or like, is this some sort of dream? Did any of this really happen? Like it ends in such a way that I think is like so unbelievable, even for this like bombastically crazy movie, that the line at the end where he's like, oh, I just had this weird feeling. What if this was all a dream? The only problem is that like, it's not handled artfully at all. So there's no, like, you don't leave with any sense of like profundity. You're just like, yeah, man, or not. I don't know. Like, whatever.
If you think about what is actually achieved by the end of the film, it, you know, I suppose the liberation of many Martians and people living on Mars is one of them, but the focus has always been on whether or not Quaid feels like he's made a contribution, whether or not he's remarkable, whether or not he was destined for something else bigger, right? And what you see is him fulfilling that fantasy, being destined for something else much grander. In fact, saving, creating, making a more habitable world. But so I do think that the ease of that achievement, even though I guess it wasn't easy, but like achieving that as the goal points to how that's what he went to go to recall for to begin with, is to just like make himself feel better about, you know, being a schlubby dude who didn't contribute anything.
Which kind of goes back to what Kat was saying in terms of the casting. Like he's not an everyman that you would like attach yourself onto to be like, I want to have an impact in the world and do something good for the world and, you know, whatever, what have you. Like there's no one who's in that audience that's like, yeah, I'm just like that. You know, I'm just like Arnold Schwarzenegger. A friend of mine was telling me about how in college they were obsessed with Arnold Schwarzenegger and like getting really ripped and, you know, read everything that they could, and then at the end of Schwarzenegger's bio, it's like, yeah, we just did a bunch of steroids. Like this isn't possible. And you're like, God damn it.
But I did want to say, like, as someone who was growing up in the 80s, right, and you know, who was like finishing high school like around the time that in 1991, so this, you know, movie came out like right in that zone, I do think that there was this fantasy that by simple, and increasingly so for men, simple cosmetic transformations to yourself, you could be more meaningful. You could be more important, like getting buff, becoming a buff dude, and that kind of body culture. Sure, there was bodybuilding culture in the 50s, 60s, etc. But the way that, you know, like even just Schwarzenegger's career played out, and his own star text as somebody who's like, from pumping iron, you know what I mean? It's like the idea that, and it was a moment where everybody, all the baseball players were taking steroids too, right? So to become heroes. So
well, and that's what happens today. Like when Chris Hemsworth is in, or whoever is in Men's Health saying like, I eat 10 chickens every day. And it's like, we all know that's not true. Like, it's just, why are you pretending? Like there's no, it's fine. It's fine. Like, you know, just tell us how it happens. Like, but there's this notion that you can just do that and you'll look like Thor.
I will say in a very small sample size here that once my wife and I rented out our place, because we were out of town, rented out our place to 3 Australian actors who were here for pilot season. And when we returned, I mean, there were endless chicken breasts, skinless, boneless chicken breasts in the freezer, lots of, nut oils, so much coconut oil, all of these things. I was like, there are dudes here. And every time we'd call just to ask about anything related to the house, they'd be working out.
Yeah.
So,
this shit's real. It's like lean, high protein is all you eat. Like you choke down a dry chicken breast 3 times a day and eat egg whites and like guzzle that shit down, right? For like
cans of
bodybuilding stuff.
crushed tomatoes.
Yeah. Oh man.
But also like, and I've watched Pumping Iron and a couple of those like behind the scenes, like also right before a competition, they pound a bunch of sugar so that their veins pump out and they look even like more muscular. And that like on set right before any of these scenes are shot, they're like doing curls, like they want to look as buff as possible in that moment. Okay, can we go back to the recall office? So I know we're jumping around because this is just we don't need to really talk about the plot.
It's impressionistic. I think that's the thing, is like you kind of know once the plot is set in motion, everything is determined by these bursts of action, right?
Yeah.
So it's okay to jump around, I think.
Totally. And like he's supposed to be a little bit confused about what's happening as well. But I loved this moment, and I feel like this happened throughout the 90s, where there would just be these sort of nods to like culture and cultural norms and trends that were changing. So when he's asked what his sexual orientation is, and he's like hetero, and she gives this little like, like this little like, oh, is that so? Like there was just this moment, and I feel like that happened in every type of movie. Like it happened in Mr. Holland's Opus, where it was like 2 boys holding hands. Times sure have changed. Like there's just these acknowledgments of like, we're in the 90s, we get it. Like, I don't know. I just kind of wanted to like acknowledge that. And then 5 seconds later, he's choosing from like big titted skinny woman to like big titted, slightly less skinny woman to like various like ethnic derogatory phrases that he could like choose, for what type of woman. So it was like, what this notion of like, are we supposed to feel like this is a progressive world? Maybe.
Yeah, well, that's the contradiction. I think that, again, this is like the second time I think I've referred to erotic 80s, but that, that the people we're sorting through is like, okay, how do you accommodate for sexual liberation in some way, sexual expansion, but still keep the societal structure and the patriarchal structure intact, right? And so I think that this is, this film, and and kind of Verhoeven, as he continues on to the 90s, does this, is present supposed sexual freedom, the freedom to maybe consider something other than hetero, but what you get eventually is the foreclosure of all of that back into basically the straight dude's wishes and desires and his fantasies. That is what reigns foremost in the end, is like, does his fantasy become fulfilled? Mm-hmm. Do his fantasies, all of them?
Yeah. Well, what a movie, everybody.
So much Pepsi, by the way, in the
yeah.
They obviously paid for that.
Maybe in the bonus we can talk a little bit about how to account for the future in contemporary times in science fiction, because that's something I think about a lot and is related to this piece around like including hetero, which is acknowledging that there is any other kind of sexuality,
and just to acknowledge it, because I'm sure listeners will be like, how did you do a whole episode about Total Recall, like, and not mention Quanto, like
Quanto?
Just like, I don't know, just wanted to mention it. Like, I really don't have anything to say about it, except that I did think that puppet was awesome. And so were all of the animatronic weird heads and faces. But
the practical effects in this movie are fucking amazing. Like it is, and just the creativity, like where his head splits apart in like pieces, and like the woman's head when he's pretending to be this woman. Like there's so much, the X-ray machine, like we got kind of deep into stuff, I don't know, 80s body stuff, but like the visuals of this, the security screen, the world building is magnificent. Like it's worth it just for me, it's worth it just for that experience. Speaking of experiences, we will be right back to share some freakouts.
The Games and Online Harassment Hotline is a text message-based, anonymous, and confidential emotional support hotline, and it's created specifically for the gaming community. Because we're gamers and creators, and we want to help each other. So, how does it work? Well, you text us and we listen. Our hotline is 100% anonymous. We can talk about anything you need to, and only what you want to. The Games and Online Harassment Hotline is an inclusive resource for anyone, no matter how you identify. If you feel that you need emotional support, you can start right now by texting support to 23368, and our qualified responders will be there to listen to you, free of charge. Reach out, get help, and let's make this community a better place to work and play.
What's your freak out?
Now it's time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. Karen, what are you freaking out about?
What am I not freaking out about, truth be told? And I think that this is probably a question that you grapple with in each episode. It's sort of like, you know, sure, we're in the last days of the Weimar Republic. We're in the last, 20 minutes of Cabaret. This is, and it's coming faster than we thought.
Yeah.
So, with each new day, there is a new point of verification that we are fully entering into fascism, to continue the conversation about Total Recall and Paul Verhoeven. But because we are in the last days of the Weimar Republic, I thought it only appropriate to bring up the fact that I went to a piano bar recently, very masked up, because I'm very concerned about the BA5 variant. And I'd had COVID in February, and it's just sort of like I had my Rumspringa after that. But a show that provided us comfort in those weird saddle years where things maybe gave us hope that the US could change in some way. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Rachel Bloom hosted a sing-along at the Stowaway, which is a beautiful new piano bar in downtown Los Angeles. And it was really just such a kind of down-home, fun, kind of fanish experience where she was leading songs, fans were leading songs, members of the cast were there. And I mention it not just to make people envious because it happened once live and I was there, but this is apparently going to happen with some frequency. So if you live in the Los Angeles area and you need to sing it out, like I said, the final 15 minutes of Cabaret, come join us at the Stowaway.
I'm so excited to learn that there's a piano bar in downtown LA. That's like cool. Like that's what I'm taking away from this. Also, Rachel Bloom was doing just a run of her new comedy series at the Dynasty Typewriter, and I missed it, but I wanted to check that out because, she's a funny lady.
And this place, it's a beautiful bar. It's sort of underground, and it's easy. It's large enough to where if you're not super comfortable and not feeling, COVID safe, you can kind of step away and still enjoy the fun and be in a kind of more spacious area. I can imagine how difficult it is for live venues to recover or to thrive, especially those that started up during the pandemic. As the pandemic rages on.
Except it feels like nobody in LA gives a shit about COVID anymore. And that's, whatever, it's terrifying a little bit.
Well, that's definitely part of the freak out. So, it's all these things, the combo, pandemic, end of the Republic, et cetera, et cetera.
And piano bars.
Exactly.
We're all going to fucking die. I would love to die like chilling in piano bars, listen to cool music.
This is good. This is good to know because I was recently, I've thought for the last 2 years, like, am I never going to do karaoke ever again? Like that's probably been the hardest thing for me to grapple with among the million deaths and everything else. I'm like, am I really never going to do karaoke ever again? Maybe one day. Anita.
One day. Yes.
Bring me out of this funk. What are you freaking out about?
Oh boy.
My favorite movie of 2022.
Are you ready? Okay. So y'all might have heard of a movie called RRR. It's gotten loads of buzz. It's a Tollywood movie, which means it's from the Telugu cinema film industry. So everyone's talking about this movie, right? It was in theaters for a run in the US, and then Netflix picked it up, and it's 3 hours long. And when am I ever going to watch this fucking thing? But everyone's talking about it, blah, blah. Yesterday, my friend dragged me out to a screening of this movie because it's not really screening in many places anymore. This was like the last dregs of it. Okay, before I tell you about it, first of all, the screening was in the original language. So what you're going to get on Netflix if you watch it is dubbed in Hindi, which is not the original language, which I think sucks. And it has something to do with the distribution rights of all of the different dubbings. And so Netflix got that distribution right. Blech. Okay, here's the thing. This movie is a movie which takes place during the British colonization of India. It's set in the 1920s. It's this fictional story about these two men with these like different experiences and agendas, and then they become besties. And then they don't, and then they do, and whatever movies. I'm so grateful that I watched it in a theater. I'm so grateful that I watched it in a theater where multiple people in that theater knew what to expect, because it was like raucous, like cheering and explosion and like audience interaction. This movie I walked out of the theater feeling like I was high, and I wasn't drinking or anything. Like I legitimately was like hyped and high, and I blared the soundtrack on my way home. Like I cannot quite explain what you're getting into. It is not without problems representationally. It is extremely violent, but it is so joyous to both watch brown folks like getting one up on these like shitty white colonizers. And it's also the direction of it, the way the storytelling is, the effects of like the really over the top extreme violence. One of the main characters is so hot that I literally, I don't do this that often, but the whole time I was like, holy fuck. And then at some point he has long hair, and then I'm just dead. Like, that's just it. It's like over it for me. And I was like, I can't take this. So it is visually stimulating, the acting, the characters, the choreography. I feel like I'm not doing it. I feel like I just said a lot of words that are not selling this movie, because I like still can't stop thinking about like how much it made me feel so much joy in such a joyless moment.
Also, one of the main actors looks just like John Belushi.
Oh, weird.
Maybe.
That was the only thing that took me out of it. I am so sad that I didn't see this in theaters. I really wanted to. I just missed my window, but hopefully it'll be back. Maybe
there's so much hype.
Yeah.
I feel like it might be something that like theaters get to run for these, like, not sing along, but like, like hype along. I would 100% see it again. There were multiple people in my theater who were like, yeah, I've seen it 5 times already. Like, it is. I keep being like, I'm going to find the words that's going to immediately explain how it is. But like you'll watch it and then you'll be like, oh, I get it. Cause it's such a ride. And like, I know we all sit down and watch like 8 episodes of a TV show, and then you're like, well, that was fucking 8 hours. Whoops. But like sitting down and watching a 3-hour movie feels like a different type of commitment. And it flies by. Like, it's just, you're so enthralled and immersed in this world. And
Karen, have you seen RRR?
I haven't seen it yet. I mean, it's like, to sustain my narrative attention, it's a lot lately. Like, it takes a lot to and even to sit and binge or anything like that. But a true 3-hour narrative. I think I tried to see something recently. I can't even remember what it was that I tried to sit through that was several hours. And
was it Drive My Car? That was the last 3-hour movie.
Oh, yes, it was. Yes. And I actually really appreciate, I just sort of like, surrendered to the mood. Right.
Yeah.
And
I feel like that movie, I feel like Drive My Car earned that 3 hours. Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say, and I did, like, I watched a lot of Bollywood movies in high school. So like I had experience. I know this is Tollywood, but I'd experience with like these epic films. I think both Drive My Car and RRR have chapters. So there is like that that ability. You know, there's the whole kind of prologue of Drive My Car, which is its own short film before.
Yeah, it's
like,
40
the rest
minutes
happens.
before the fucking title card comes up in that movie.
And I
Yeah.
think RRR is similar, where you're kind of like, here's this fable. All right, now let's go to this other character. Here's this fable. Okay, now we're going to bring them together and you're going to have that sequence for half an hour. But even though I've only seen it on Netflix, I do go back and watch the Desi Notch dance scene just like whenever.
Honestly, I was just thinking that like after I'm done work today, I might just go watch that scene again. Like just the dance off. The two for those who have watched it, the two scenes that I like keep coming back to are the dance off and the fucking animals. Like just that moment where the animals happen. None of these are spoilers because you have no idea what I'm talking about.
Animals happening.
Yeah,
that sounds
animals
intriguing.
happening. Yeah. But if you know exactly what I'm talking about. So anyways, that's my freak out. Sincerely, like I've had a hard time finding joy in anything lately, and like even things that I normally like. And this was such a reprieve from all of that for me. So anyways, watch it on Netflix if you can't watch it anywhere else, because it's still worth it. I just am rubbing it in everyone's faces that I got to not do that. Kat, what are you freaking out about?
I'm freaking out about something so sweet and simple by comparison. So have either of you watched the Netflix series City of Ghosts?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
I love that show. It's very dear.
It's very dear. So I just last night I went to the IRL premiere of Elizabeth Ito's new short. It did officially its world premiere happened in Fortnite, but they had an IRL premiere of the short film Mall Stories at the Burbank Town Center. And I had really loved City of Ghosts. It's a children's cartoon series that blends documentary and animation. It's about a ghost club that some children have in Los Angeles, where they meet at the LA Public Library, and they go to different neighborhoods around LA and interview ghosts or interview people who are being haunted by a ghost. And
that's adorable.
It is so adorable. And each episode focuses on a specific neighborhood and uses these ghost stories to teach you about the history of the neighborhood. So there's a Boyle Heights episode that talks about the history of Japanese Americans in Boyle Heights. There's a Venice episode that talks about skateboarders. There's a beautiful episode about Tongvanar and the indigenous history of this region. As a native Angelino, I really, really loved this show. I love the kind of representation that you see of children who comfortably use each other's pronouns and who are having this lovely experience just talking about ghosts and talking into a hairbrush while they're taping themselves filming ghost stories. So her new short film, Mall Stories, profiles the Mongolian Grill, which is a restaurant in the Burbank Mall's food court. And the Mongolian Grill is like a staple of LA mall food courts and like California mall food courts. I learned last night that is not common necessarily on the East Coast or in other regions. I thought that was just like hot dog on a stick. It's at every mall food court. You go and there's Mongolian Grill. And what's really cool about it is how basically Elizabeth Ito had worked at Cartoon Network. Which is across the street from the Burbank Mall. She'd always go to Mongolian Grill and get lunch. She ended up having the opportunity to make this short, and she just went up to the girl who owns the place and was like, "Hey, can I interview you for a cartoon documentary?" Like, the girl was like, "What? No, I'm busy. Like, there's a rush happening. Leave me alone." So they ended up doing it, and it's just this lovely short. It's on YouTube. It's like 7 minutes long, and it is the real story of a Korean American woman who owns a small business in a dying mall. I say dying mall, even though I go to the Burbank Mall like 5 times a week. But as we know, mall culture is not what it once was, and just talks about like being a business owner after and during the pandemic, and the manager who is really organized, and the guy who works there who singed his arm hairs when he was trying to learn how to do Mongolian Grill. And it's just this like lovely little slice of life. So I'm really intrigued when animation is able to be used as a medium and not strictly as children's entertainment. but to show kind of real people and real cultures, and like how it just feels so LA to me also to have like the story of a Korean American Burbank girl who bought her dad's Mongolian grill restaurant that she worked at since she was a teenager in the Burbank Mall. And now it's in this like Unreal Engine animated documentary short. Like it's just cool and weird and awesome and lovely. And you should watch it.
And I will add about City of Ghosts too, is that many of the episodes are also food centric and have to do with how food culture is so interwoven into these different places in Los Angeles, whether or not it's a sad musician ghost inhabiting a Korean barbecue restaurant, or the very first episode, which is about a young Filipino chef, like, you know, trying to make a go of it in Boyle Heights and having to negotiate with the ghost of someone, Japanese occupant of the place, who, you know, does not like the way she's making her katsu and tempura. So yeah, that's go for it.
Wonderful. Well, that is our show for today. Thank you, Karen, for joining us.
It was a pleasure to be here.
I mean, I always love talking to you. I love to hear you on Waiting to Exhale and various other podcasts. Tell our audience where they can learn more about you.
You can find me on Twitter at Inland Emperor, but also look up the Waiting to Exhale. That's X-HALE podcast, a show about the forgotten generation and everything you've forgotten about Generation X, which I co-host and co-produce with Winter Mitchell Rohrbass. So if you want to hear more explorations of pop culture and indeed malls, because what is Gen X culture but malls, feel free to check us out. You can also find me making food videos because I'm very into food. I'm a food motivated person, as I like to say, on Instagram at Tongsonator.
Immediately following that, we back pre-Kat, our bonus episodes were largely filled with Ebony and I talking about our food adventures. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure having you. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and you can find me at Anita Sarkeesian on all of the things.
I'm Kat Spada, and you can find me on Twitter at cat_ex_machina. And please be sure to follow Feminist Frequency at FEMFREQ, FemFreak.
If you are a Patreon subscriber, be sure to stick around for the bonus episode with our guest, Karen Tongson.
If you like our show, please help other people find it by subscribing, rating, and commenting on your favorite podcatcher. Thanks so much for listening.
Bye.